Have you ever stumbled upon something in your home that made your heart skip a beat? Not just a dusty photo album or a box of old toys, but something that felt like it was never meant to be found? Maybe it was tucked away behind a wall, buried deep in the attic, or locked so tightly you almost didn't bother opening it. But then you did. And what you found changed everything. Now, imagine this happening to you, not in a dream or a movie, but in real life, in your own family's attic. One locked box. No key. No label. Just a sense, deep in your gut, that whatever's inside isn't just old junk. It's a secret. And not just any secret, one that flips your entire family's history upside down. If you clicked on this video because the title caught your eye, trust me when I say you're going to get the answer you came here for. You won't just hear what was inside the box. You'll understand why it had to stay hidden for so long, and how its contents would change the lives of 3 generations. But to truly get it, to feel the gravity of what was discovered, you have to hear the story from the beginning. And I promise, once you do, you won't be able to look away. Now I know what you're probably thinking. This is just another viral mystery story, exaggerated for clicks. But I want you to listen carefully because this isn't a ghost story or some fantasy. It's real. Every emotion, every twist, every heartbreaking detail. You see, this story isn't just about a son and a locked box. It's about identity, betrayal, forgiveness, and the way one small object can unravel a carefully built illusion of family. If you've ever wondered what secrets your own relatives might be keeping, or felt like there's more to your past than what you've been told, then this story will hit close to home. Because sometimes, the most life-altering truths are the ones buried under decades of dust, behind a door nobody dares to open. Until one day, someone finally does. Let me take you there, to the moment it all began. It was early spring, the kind of warm April afternoon that makes you want to roll down the windows and air out the house. You know that feeling? When the world starts waking up again after a long winter, and there's this itch to clean, organize, maybe even explore a little. That's exactly where our story begins, with a son named Daniel, home from college to help his aging father sort through their family's old New England farmhouse. The place had been in their family for nearly a century, passed down like an heirloom itself, filled with creaky floors, stained wallpaper, and the kind of smell that only old houses have, a mix of cedar, dust, and forgotten memories. Daniel wasn't particularly close with his dad, John, who had always been a quiet, private man. Stoic. The type who believed in hard work, silence, and leaving the past in the past. But after Daniel's mother passed away unexpectedly the year before, John had begun to deteriorate, both physically and emotionally. That's why Daniel came home, to help his dad downsize, clear out the clutter, and maybe, in the process, reconnect. But what he found in that attic would do more than reconnect father and son. It would reveal a version of their family neither of them ever knew existed. The attic hadn't been touched in decades. Cobwebs laced the wooden beams like lace curtains, and old trunks sat under layers of grime, untouched since who knows when. Daniel, half out of curiosity and half out of duty, began opening boxes and flipping through faded photographs, love letters, and military memorabilia from World War II. It was peaceful at first, even nostalgic, until he reached the far corner of the attic. Tucked behind an antique dresser, beneath a moth-eaten quilt, was a small metal box. Heavy, rusted, locked. No markings. No explanation. Just there, as if it had been waiting all this time. He called for his dad, who slowly made his way up the ladder, gripping the railing like it was the only thing holding him to the earth. When John saw the box, he froze. Not confused. Not curious. Afraid. Daniel asked him if he recognized it. His father didn't answer. He just stared at it, breathing heavily, his knuckles white against the wood. And then he said 5 words Daniel would never forget. That box should stay closed. But here's the thing. You can't unsee something like that. You can't just forget it exists. Daniel didn't want to disrespect his dad's wishes, but the look in John's eyes wasn't just fear, it was guilt. As if that box held something too powerful, too devastating to be confronted. But what kind of truth could be so dangerous it had to be locked away for an entire lifetime? And why now, after all these years? Did it resurface? As the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the attic floor, Daniel found himself alone with the box. And this, my friend, is where the story takes a turn. You see, sometimes our families protect us from the truth. Not out of cruelty, but because the truth is heavy, and not everyone is strong enough to carry it. But Daniel? He needed to know. Not just for himself, but for the future of their family. He needed to know who they really were. And so, while his father slept downstairs, Daniel stayed up. He examined the lock, tried to force it, even considered smashing it open, but something told him to wait. The next morning, when he returned to the attic, the box was gone. That's right. Vanished. No explanation. Just gone. Now, at this point, you're probably gripping your phone or staring at your screen wondering what happened next. And trust me, this is where things really start to unravel. Because what Daniel eventually uncovers isn't just a family secret. It's a legacy of deception that traces back nearly 70 years, and it involves a name that's been erased from every photo, every document, and every story his family ever told. And here's the master move I want you to catch. You clicked this video for a reason. Curiosity. Intrigue. That need to know. And I'm not just going to feed you breadcrumbs. I'm going to give you everything, the who, the why, the fallout, and how this discovery didn't just reveal a forgotten chapter, it rewrote the entire book. You'll understand why the box was locked, why it disappeared, and what it truly means for the people still alive today. But more than that, you'll walk away asking yourself the same haunting question Daniel did. What if everything you knew about your family was a lie? So settle in, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a journey through hidden pasts, emotional truths, and the kind of revelation that leaves a permanent mark. I'm going to take you from attic floorboards to forgotten cemeteries, through war-torn letters and whispered conversations that were never supposed to be repeated. And you'll see how one young man's choice to open a single box didn't just expose a buried secret. It brought peace to generations who never got the answers they deserved. But right before I take you inside that box, let me leave you with this thought. When Daniel finally uncovered the truth, when he held in his hands the documents, the letters, the photographs, the confession, it wasn't what he expected. In fact, it was worse. Because the contents of that box didn't just change his opinion of one family member, they changed the way he saw every person who ever carried his last name. And just when he thought the worst was over, he flipped one final envelope and saw a face he knew. A face he trusted. A face he never imagined would be tied to something so dark. What was inside that envelope? Who did it reveal? And why had someone gone to such great lengths to erase them from history? You're about to find out. But first, let's go back to where it all began. Daniel Matthews hadn't planned on coming home so soon after graduation. Like most 24-year-olds chasing freedom after college, his heart was set on big cities, startups, and all-night coffee shops filled with ambition and noise. But when the call came from his father's neighbor saying John had fallen while trying to change a light bulb, of all things, Daniel knew it was time. He didn't argue, didn't hesitate. He just packed his life into his weathered Subaru, turned the ignition, and drove back to New Haven, Connecticut, where the streets still whispered with memories of bike rides, old friends, and the silent weight of a family that never talked too much. Coming home wasn't just a return to four creaky walls and a leaky roof. It was stepping back into a house filled with silence that sometimes felt louder than words. His dad wasn't the emotional type. A Korean War vet turned machinist, John believed in hard work, black coffee, and keeping skeletons well and truly in the closet. And that's exactly what made that rusted metal box feel so out of place, because it didn't belong in a house where nothing was ever said and everything was kept neatly tucked away, emotionally and literally. The house was older than some American states and looked like it belonged in a Civil War reenactment. Tall, narrow, with slanted floorboards that groaned under the weight of time. It smelled like old varnish, burned toast, and the same floor cleaner his mom used for years before she passed. Since then, the place had grown darker, less lived in, more like a museum to a life that had already ended. But even before the box, Daniel had always felt something off about this house. As a child, he'd asked questions his father ignored. Who was the woman in the old portrait above the fireplace? Why were there two empty spots in the family photo albums labeled with just initials, Yem and JR, but no pictures, no details? Why was the third floor always locked until he was old enough to understand? But he never did. Not really. And any time he came close, John would change the subject, tighten his jaw, or leave the room entirely. So Daniel stopped asking. Until that day in the attic. It wasn't just the box that felt suspicious. It was everything that came after. The disappearance. The way his father avoided eye contact during dinner that night. The way the neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, seemed startled when Daniel mentioned the attic, her voice faltering before she quickly excused herself. Something was happening. Something that had nothing to do with light bulbs or spring cleaning. And for the first time in his life, Daniel had the sense that his family, what little of it remained, was balancing on the edge of something much darker than he'd imagined. But he didn't know where to start. The box was gone. His father refused to talk. And the attic, now strangely organized, looked like no one had touched it in years. The next few days passed in a strange haze. Daniel tried to go through the motions, grocery runs, doctor appointments, sorting out prescriptions, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was trying to cover something up. On the third morning, he found himself standing in front of the town's public records office, staring through the glass doors, wondering if there might be something, anything, that could help him understand. It was a long shot, but curiosity had a way of making even the most mundane buildings feel like treasure vaults. Inside, the woman behind the desk greeted him with a warm, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When he mentioned his family name, she stiffened. And when he asked about archived property records for the house, she asked him to wait, twice, before handing him a dusty folder and walking away quickly, almost nervously. Inside the folder, among land deeds and tax records, was a photocopy of an article clipped from a 1973 edition of the New Haven Register. No headline, just a picture, faded, blurry, and a byline that simply read, "Questions remain unanswered in disappearance of Emily Matthews." That name stopped him cold. Emily Matthews. The same initials, Yem, that appeared on the empty photo album slot. Daniel stared at the photo. It was barely legible, but the young woman in the picture had his eyes. His chin. A resemblance that wasn't just familiar, it was undeniable. His fingers trembled as he read the short blurb beneath it. A 22-year-old local college student. Disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No suspects. No trace. Case still open, 48 years later. The folder didn't contain much else, but that one page was enough to change the direction of everything. Who was Emily? Why had no one ever spoken her name? And how was it possible that her face, so clearly part of his bloodline, was never once mentioned in all his years of asking about family? Daniel left the office more shaken than when he arrived. He had come looking for history. What he found was a person, someone his father had erased entirely. Someone who had been part of their family until she suddenly wasn't. The same day, Daniel went back into the attic. This time, he moved the old furniture, lifted floorboards, searched behind walls. He wasn't just looking for a box anymore. He was looking for her. But the attic didn't give up its secrets easily. What he did find was something odd, wedged behind a support beam, hidden so carefully it took nearly half an hour to even notice. A tiny locket, covered in dust, its gold chain wrapped around a nail, as if someone had hung it there and forgotten. Inside the locket was a photo of two children, a girl and a boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. On the back of the photo, in faint pencil, was written, "To keep us close. Love, E and J." Daniel sat back, overwhelmed. E and J. Emily and John? Was this his father? And if so, how could someone keep a sibling, someone they clearly loved, from ever being mentioned? The questions were multiplying faster than he could keep up. And the answers were nowhere in sight. At dinner that night, Daniel confronted his father. Gently but directly. He asked about Emily. The room turned cold. John didn't speak for a long while. Then he looked up, his eyes watery and distant, and said, Some ghosts are better left where they are. That was it. No explanation. No anger. Just a quiet, almost mournful resignation. As if talking about Emily would open a door he'd spent half a century nailing shut. But Daniel wasn't ready to stop digging. And that's when the red flags started piling up. The neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, who had always been so warm when Daniel was younger, now avoided him. When he asked if she remembered anything about Emily, her voice dropped and she told him, "Some stories ain't yours to tell, honey," before shutting the door a little too quickly. Then there was the pastor from the church where Daniel's mother used to sing. He remembered Emily, said she had a beautiful voice too, maybe even better than her sister.
Wait.
Sister? That didn't make sense. His mother was an only child. At least, that's what he had been told his entire life. And just like that, another layer peeled back. The mystery wasn't just about the box or the attic anymore. It was about a family tree that had branches no one ever talked about. A tree with missing names, missing faces, and suddenly more questions than answers. Who was Emily really? Was she his aunt? Or was there more to the story? Something deeper, something darker? Then came the phone call. An unknown number. A woman's voice.
Soft. Shaky.
She asked if he was Daniel Matthews. When he said yes, there was a pause, and then she said, "Don't trust anyone. Not even him. He's not who you think." Before he could ask who she was, the line went dead. Now, Daniel found himself spiraling, unsure who to believe or where to turn. His father's silence. The neighbor's fear. The pastor's slip of the tongue. The woman on the phone. And the locked box, now gone without a trace. Each piece felt connected. But how? Who was lying? Who was protecting the truth? And what were they so afraid he'd discover? The walls of his childhood home suddenly felt like a maze. Every hallway, every creak, every shadow held meaning. And Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that someone, maybe even someone still alive, didn't want him to solve the puzzle. But it was too late.
He was in it now.
Neck deep. And soon, he would learn the real secret wasn't just what was in the box. It was who put it there. The morning after that mysterious phone call, Daniel couldn't shake the uneasy weight in his chest. He replayed the woman's voice over and over in his head, how deliberate her words sounded, how familiar the tone felt. But no matter how hard he tried to place her, it slipped through his memory like water through his fingers. He checked the call log again, no number, just unknown caller. He even tried dialing back, but the line was dead. That alone was enough to rattle him, but things were only beginning to unravel. When he returned to the attic later that day, hoping to retrace his steps and maybe even find some overlooked clue, another photo, maybe a journal page tucked behind the beams, the locket was gone. Just gone. As if it had never been there in the first place. The nail it once hung from was still bent slightly, still marked by the chain's indentation in the dust. But the locket, the photo, everything vanished. That was the first time Daniel truly questioned if someone was watching him. The idea had seemed paranoid at first. This was just an old house, not some Hollywood crime scene.
But now?
Now, he wasn't so sure. Doors he remembered locking were slightly ajar in the morning. Picture frames were tilted ever so slightly on the walls. His backpack, which he always left zipped, had been rummaged through. His laptop browser history had been cleared. Someone was in the house. Someone who didn't want him putting the puzzle together. That realization changed everything. He began looking over his shoulder, sleeping with one eye open, and double-checking every lock before bed. Later that afternoon, he took a walk through the neighborhood to clear his head. He ended up outside the Matthews family's old storage unit, a rusting metal container tucked behind a shuttered industrial park. He had nearly forgotten it existed until a vague memory returned, his mother arguing with his father about keeping things locked away instead of dealing with them. She'd said it in hushed tones one night, thinking Daniel was asleep. But he'd heard. Back then he assumed it was about old clothes or tools. Now he wasn't so sure. The unit was still under his father's name, and Daniel, being listed as a secondary contact, was able to access it. But when he opened the door, a sharp chemical scent hit him like a punch. The air was musty, soaked in the aroma of paint thinner and mildew. Most of the boxes were stacked neatly and labeled holiday decor, old tools, 1978 taxes. But one box sat in the back, unmarked, heavy, and wrapped in black plastic. As he peeled back the wrapping, a chill ran down his spine. Inside were hundreds of loose photographs, many yellowed at the corners, some torn in half. Pictures of family gatherings he'd never seen before, birthdays, picnics, church events. And there, in multiple photos, was a young woman with a familiar face. Her arm was always around a young man. Sometimes that man was his father. Sometimes it was someone else, a tall, striking figure Daniel didn't recognize. But in each picture, there was warmth, closeness, and a secret. He was about to snap photos of the images with his phone when a sharp knock echoed behind him. He jumped, nearly dropping the box. Standing in the doorway was a tall, older man dressed in a faded military jacket. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he said, "You need to stop looking. Some stories end in places you don't want to go." Daniel stared at him, heart pounding, trying to read the man's face. Was he threatening him? Warning him? The man didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching the gravel outside. When Daniel rushed out after him, the man was already gone. No car, no sign, nothing. Daniel called the storage facility manager, hoping for camera footage. The manager, a stout, skeptical man named Art, pulled up the feed with some reluctance. But when they played back the camera near his unit during the time the man appeared, there was nothing. No one entering, no one exiting. Just Daniel. Alone. Art frowned and scratched his head. "Maybe it's a glitch," he mumbled, but the way his eyes lingered on the screen said otherwise. Back home, Daniel began cross-referencing old photos with online databases, social media archives, and even digital obituaries. He was desperate to figure out who the man in the photos with Emily was. One lead led him to a man named James Rowe, a name that matched the second set of initials in the photo album slot. JR, the dates lined up. Age, background, even the hometown. James and Emily had gone to high school together. The more Daniel read, the more disturbing things got. James disappeared the same year Emily did. Same month.
Same week.
Yet, unlike Emily, his case was ruled a runaway and never investigated further. No news coverage. No police involvement. Just a brief notice in a forgotten school bulletin. As if someone had erased his existence from the record. And yet someone remembered. Daniel got a Facebook message that night. No name, just a blank profile photo. The message read, "You're looking in the wrong places." The truth wasn't buried. It was traded. That single sentence sent him spiraling. Traded? What did that mean? Traded for what? Or worse, for who? The next day, he tried to press his father one more time. This time, John reacted with uncharacteristic rage. He slammed his coffee mug so hard the handle cracked off, shards spilling across the table. "You don't know what you're doing, Daniel," he barked, his eyes fiery and full of something Daniel had never seen before, fear. Not just worry. Not guilt. Actual fear. And behind it, something deeper, grief? Regret? Daniel didn't push further. He simply stared back, his silence louder than any accusation. That night, sleep wouldn't come. His thoughts twisted with every possibility. Was his father protecting someone? Was he responsible? Did he make a deal all those years ago that cost them both Emily and James? And what could be so dangerous about the past that even now, nearly 50 years later, people were still trying to keep it hidden? The next morning, the biggest blow yet hit him like a freight train. Every photo he had saved from the storage unit was gone. His phone had reset overnight. No photos. No messages. No browser history. Everything wiped. At first, he thought it was a glitch. But then he found a single sticky note on the kitchen counter, nothing written on it except a hand-drawn symbol. A triangle with a circle inside, and a line running through it. It looked familiar, though he couldn't place it. Something he'd seen once, maybe on a patch, a book, or maybe a uniform? He took the note and held it under the light. Something about it felt older than it looked. Almost like a signature, like someone had left it not as a warning, but as a calling card. Now, the mystery wasn't just personal. It wasn't just about family. It was bigger. Someone or something was covering up a story that stretched decades. A story with names removed from records, photos destroyed, voices silenced. And Daniel knew, without a doubt, that if he stopped now, he'd never know the truth about Emily, James, or even his father. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, is that someone had already decided to stop him. And that person had just arrived in town. Just 2 towns over, in a quiet suburb outside Charleston, a woman named Claire Hartley stepped out onto her porch to retrieve the mail, expecting nothing more than bills and local coupons. Instead, nestled between an electric company envelope and a gardening catalog was a manila envelope with no return address. Her name was written in sharp, deliberate cursive across the front. No postage, no markings, just placed there. She frowned, her pulse quickening. It was the kind of envelope that demanded to be opened in private. Claire wasn't just anyone. She was Daniel's godmother, Emily's closest friend from high school, and once upon a time, the keeper of more secrets than she ever let on. She and Emily had been inseparable until the summer Emily vanished, and after that, Claire's life had slowly unraveled. Marriages, jobs, friendships, they all slipped through her hands like dry sand. Still, she had rebuilt over the years, made peace with the past, or so she told herself. But as she slid open the envelope and pulled out a single photograph, all that false calm evaporated. It was a black and white photo, clearly aged, of 3 teenagers standing in a field. Claire, Emily, and James.
She gasped.
She hadn't seen this photo in over 40 years, and yet here it was, in her hands, crisp and cold like it had been preserved just for this moment. But what truly rattled her wasn't the image itself, it was what was written on the back. Scrawled in red ink. "He's closer than you think. And so is your turn." There was no signature, just the same symbol Daniel had found on the sticky note, the triangle, the circle, the line. Claire stumbled back, her knees nearly buckling under the weight of the message. Her first instinct was to call Daniel. She hadn't spoken to him since his father's funeral, but something in her gut told her this was no coincidence. The box he had found, the photo she now held, the vanishing locket, it was all connected. When she finally reached him, Daniel answered on the first ring. His voice was strained, worn thin by sleepless nights and too many unanswered questions. Claire wasted no time. "I got a photo."
Of us.
Me, Emily, and James. It just appeared. No return address. There was a silence on the other end, thick enough to choke on. "Daniel," she continued, "it had that same mark you told me about. And a message. They're watching me now, too." He didn't respond right away, but she could hear him breathing, fast and shallow. "Then it's not just about my family," he said finally. "It's about all of us." That night, Daniel invited Claire to the house. She brought the photo, and together, they laid it out with everything Daniel had, what little was left. But something strange happened as Claire stared at the photo longer. Her expression shifted from fear to realization. She reached for the album Daniel had found in the attic, flipping through the pages furiously. Then she froze. "This page, this one wasn't blank before," she whispered. The slot that once held a missing photo now held an entirely different one. This time, it was of Claire and John Matthews, Daniel's father, standing together in a basement Daniel didn't recognize. Both of them looked tense, serious. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, was what looked like a filing cabinet, and spray-painted on the wall above it, the same ominous symbol. Daniel recoiled. "That's not possible. That wasn't there 2 days ago. I checked that album front to back." Claire shook her head. "No, this photo was never meant to be found, not until now." The terrifying thought crept in like smoke under a door. Something, or someone, was changing the evidence, manipulating their steps, pushing them toward a specific conclusion. But who?
And why?
Then came the second blow. As they studied the photo, Claire's hand shook, and she whispered, "That basement. I know where it is." It was a place she and John had only been to once, a property on the outskirts of Beaufort, owned by a man named Wallace Carter, who had once been the head of the school board when Emily and James attended high school. Carter was infamous for his strict demeanor, but few knew of the closed-door meetings he held with parents of problem students. Daniel's stomach turned. He'd heard that name before. His father had mentioned Carter once in passing, years ago, saying only that he helped make problems disappear. Now Daniel knew that wasn't just a figure of speech. As they planned their visit to the Carter property, Daniel noticed another oddity. His phone had received a new voicemail from a number not in his contacts. He played it on speaker. The message was garbled, full of static, but a voice broke through for just a second. A child's voice. "Don't let them trade you too." Then it cut out. Daniel stared at Claire, wide-eyed. "What trade?" he asked aloud, his voice cracking. She didn't answer. She looked pale, as if she had just remembered something she'd been trying to forget for decades. "When Emily got pregnant, she told me something strange," Claire began, hesitating. "She said someone offered her a choice. A life for a life. I thought she was talking nonsense, hormones or fear, or just nerves.
But now,
I'm not so sure." Daniel's head throbbed with questions. Was this about the baby? About some bargain Emily had struck all those years ago? Was James involved or sacrificed? Had his father taken part in it all, willingly or not? As he tried to make sense of the impossible, another theory began to form, darker than anything before. What if the people behind this weren't just hiding the past, they were still operating now? Still collecting secrets, still making trades. The next day, when Daniel and Claire arrived at the Carter property, they found it abandoned. The house was still standing but gutted, windows broken, doors unhinged. But the basement was intact. Daniel pried open the cellar door, and the scent of mold and decay hit them instantly. As they stepped inside with a flashlight, the beam caught something metallic, an old filing cabinet. Just like in the photo. The drawer screeched as Daniel opened it, revealing yellow documents, faded photographs, and files stamped with words like confidential and restricted. One file had Emily's name. Another had James. But then Daniel saw something else, something that chilled him to the bone. A third folder, labeled Daniel J. Matthews, initiated, August 1999. Before he could open it, they heard a noise upstairs. A door creaked. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor. Claire froze, clutching Daniel's arm. The flashlight flickered once, then went out. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the flashlight sputtered once more and then went dark for good, plunging the basement into a thick and suffocating blackness. The sound from above, those deliberate, heavy footsteps, grew louder, slower, as if whoever was up there knew exactly what they were doing. Claire instinctively pulled him deeper into the corner of the basement, behind a rotting shelving unit stacked with decaying boxes and cobwebs. Daniel gripped the unopened file with his name on it like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. His heart pounded so hard in his chest, he was convinced the stranger could hear it through the floor. The air felt suddenly charged, electric with danger, like something awful was moments away from breaking through. Then the footsteps stopped, directly above their heads. A floorboard creaked. Something scraped across the floor, like wood dragging on wood. And then nothing. Just silence. The kind that wraps itself around your lungs and refuses to let go. When Daniel finally dared to move, it was slow, silent, calculated.
He didn't speak.
He just grabbed Claire's hand and led her toward the basement's back exit, a storm door barely visible behind hanging sheets of plastic. They emerged into the overgrown backyard, breaths shaky and limbs trembling. No car. No footprints. Whoever had entered the house was either gone or still inside, watching. Daniel didn't wait to find out. They drove in silence, adrenaline dulling their senses, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Once they reached Daniel's house, Claire locked every door and drew the blinds shut tight. It wasn't until then that Daniel finally opened the folder. Inside were pages of surveillance reports, dates, times, activities. It chronicled his childhood, from soccer games to school detentions, even conversations he had with teachers and neighbors. Some pages were photocopies of letters he'd written as a child. Others were signed reports by names he didn't recognize. But then came the photographs. There were dozens. Photos of him as a baby, then as a child playing in parks, riding a bike. And all of them appeared to be taken from a distance. Some were grainy, like they had been captured through a window. Others were sharp and crystal clear. The most recent one, though, sent ice down his spine. It was taken from outside his bedroom window. Last week. In the photo, he was asleep. And someone had been watching.
Documenting.
Labeling each moment like he was a specimen in an experiment he never agreed to join. That night, Daniel barely slept. He checked the locks 3 times. Made sure every curtain was drawn, every motion light working. But sleep finally claimed him, if only out of sheer exhaustion. And when he woke the next morning, the house was quiet, too quiet. Claire was gone. Her suitcase, her coat, the folder, they were all still there. But she wasn't. He called out for her, then checked every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. Her phone was still charging on the counter. No note. No sign of a struggle. It was like she had evaporated into the air. He called the police, but with no signs of foul play and no relationship to her, they gave him little more than a cursory shrug and the usual questions. Maybe she stepped out for a walk, the officer said. Maybe she just needed some air. But Daniel knew better. Claire wouldn't have just left. Not with everything happening. Not without the folder. Desperate, he drove back to the Carter property. Maybe she had returned. Maybe there was a clue he missed. But as he neared the edge of the wooded area, he saw something that made his stomach flip. The house was gone. Reduced to rubble. Burned to the foundation. Ash and blackened wood were all that remained. Still smoldering. A makeshift barrier of yellow caution tape flapped weakly in the breeze, the kind of thing thrown up in a hurry. No news vans. No firefighters. Just the smell of smoke and a single sign hammered into the ground. Condemned. Unsafe structure. It hadn't been there yesterday. The drive back home felt endless. The paranoia that had been quietly growing inside him began to tighten its grip. He checked his mirrors constantly. He started to notice the same gray SUV behind him for several miles. When he changed lanes, it did too. When he exited, so did it. Only after taking a series of random turns did the vehicle finally disappear, but by then, the seed had been planted. He was being watched. Maybe followed. He called a friend of his father's, someone who had served with John in the military, just to ask if his dad had ever been involved in anything classified, anything secret. The man on the other end was quiet for a moment, then said in a low, uneasy voice, "John didn't talk about everything."
He made sure of that.
"But I remember one thing. He once told me the hardest orders he ever followed weren't on the battlefield. They were in his own backyard." That phrase haunted Daniel for days. What did it mean? What orders? What happened in that house, his childhood home, that he never knew about? Then, on the 4th day after Claire's disappearance, Daniel received a package. No return address, just like the others. Inside was a burned piece of paper, charred at the edges. The handwriting was smudged but legible. It read, "You weren't supposed to find the box. But now that you have, don't go back. Or she disappears for good." He didn't need to ask who she was. They had Claire. And they were watching him more closely than ever. As he stared at the paper, his phone buzzed with a text. It was an unknown number. No words. Just a photo attachment. He opened it. It was Claire, tied to a chair in what looked like a basement, her mouth taped, her eyes wide with fear. Behind her, barely visible, was a white wall. On it was the symbol again, triangle, circle, line. Only this time, the symbol was written in what looked like blood. Daniel dropped the phone. For the first time since this all began, he felt helpless. The evidence was slipping from his hands, his closest ally was gone, and now the game had changed. This wasn't about family history anymore. It wasn't about uncovering secrets. It was about survival. And whoever was behind this, whoever had spent decades watching, documenting, manipulating, they had just made it personal. Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, the morning sun barely bleeding through the curtains, casting everything in a muted gold that did nothing to warm the unease inside him. His phone sat on the nightstand, the last image of Claire frozen on the screen. Every time he looked at it, he saw more. Her eyes weren't just wide with fear, they were wide with something else. Something he hadn't noticed before.
Hope.
Desperation. She wasn't just scared. She was trying to say something.
Communicate.
And then it hit him. Her eyes. In the photo, she was clearly staring to her right. Not at whoever was behind the camera, but at something just off frame. He enlarged the image, zooming into the shadows. There, faint and almost imperceptible, was a reflection in a metal pipe. It wasn't the captor's face. It was a logo. And it wasn't unfamiliar. He'd seen it before. At the bottom of one of the photocopied surveillance reports in the file, next to a line that had been redacted. He sprinted to the box and flipped through the papers, heart racing, palms sweating. When he found a page, he held it under the desk lamp and stared at the logo again. It was a private intelligence firm, Parallax Strategic, that had made headlines years ago during a whistleblower scandal. The same firm his father briefly consulted with after retiring from the military. At the time, Daniel thought nothing of it, just another government contractor hiring ex-military for overseas assignments. But now, as the pieces clicked together, the picture shifted into something far more disturbing. Claire wasn't taken by some rogue criminal, some shadowy figure from his dad's past. She was taken by people connected to a network his father had helped build. Desperate for answers, Daniel called the only person who might still tell him the truth, Aunt Evelyn. She was his father's older sister, reclusive and cold, but fiercely intelligent. She rarely spoke about John after his death, and had long warned Daniel not to go digging into family matters. He had avoided her house for years, but now he had no choice. When he arrived, she opened the door without a word, like she had been expecting him. Her house smelled of lavender and old paper, and every wall was lined with books, records, and dusty photographs that looked frozen in time. "I know why you're here," she said, motioning for him to sit. "But I need to warn you. Once I tell you what I know, you'll never see your father the same way again." Daniel nodded, feeling a weight settle in his stomach. John didn't just work for Parallax. He was one of the architects. After he left the military, they recruited him for a project, a psychological experiment designed to test long-term observation and emotional manipulation in controlled environments. The subjects? Families. Entire households monitored from birth. And you were one of them. Daniel froze. "What are you saying?" "You were part of a live data set. A child born into a fabricated reality. Your friendships, your teachers, even some of your neighbors, they were part of the program. Observers. Actors. Your father kept detailed logs, and your mother, she didn't know. When she found out, she threatened to leave. That's why she died in that car accident, Daniel. It wasn't an accident. The air left his lungs as if she had struck him. His mind reeled, every memory now poisoned by the possibility that none of it had been real. Every birthday party, every scraped knee, every heartfelt talk with his dad, all of it could have been part of a script. "I have something else," Evelyn said, rising slowly and retrieving a small safe from behind an old piano. She entered a code and opened it, revealing a worn cassette tape and a manila envelope. "Your father left this for you. Said you'd find it if you ever got too close." Daniel played the tape. His father's voice crackled to life, familiar, steady, and somehow different. More rehearsed. More detached. "If you're hearing this, you've likely uncovered more than I ever intended. I didn't do this to hurt you, Daniel. I did it because I was ordered to. You were chosen before you were even born. Parallax promised me that it was harmless, that you'd be monitored for cognitive development, emotional resilience. But it went too far. They started pushing boundaries, orchestrating stress,
Loss.
manipulating your friendships. Even Claire." The tape crackled. Daniel stopped it cold. "What did he say? Even Claire?" Evelyn looked down. "She wasn't just a stranger who moved next door, Daniel. She was part of the program, assigned to get close to you after college. But something went wrong. She developed feelings. Real ones. She tried to pull out, to blow the whistle. Everything tilted. The air in the room thickened, heavy with betrayal and revelation. Claire wasn't just an ally, she was an agent. An actor in the same twisted show his life had unknowingly starred in. But she had gone rogue. That's why she was taken. Not to manipulate him, this time it was punishment. She had broken the rules of the experiment. Daniel didn't know what to believe anymore. Was anything in his life real? Was his father a monster, or just a pawn in a much larger game? And Claire, did she ever truly care about him, or was it all just another scene in a well-written script? His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a picture. It was a video.
Claire.
Bruised, shaking, looking directly into the camera. "They're going to kill me, Daniel. Unless you stop. Unless you bury the truth again. Don't trust Evelyn. Don't trust anyone. The real reason this started, it wasn't about you." Before the video cut off, Daniel saw something behind her. A second figure. Hooded. Holding a photograph. A photograph of Daniel as a baby, wrapped in a hospital blanket, but in a place he didn't recognize. A different hospital. A different mother. Daniel dropped the phone as if it had burned him. Because suddenly, nothing he knew about his life, his parents, his past, even his identity, felt certain anymore. And now, the question wasn't just what was inside the locked box, but it was who was Daniel Carter really, and why had he been lied to since the day he was born? Daniel sat in his car, parked just outside the city, where the skyline gave way to back roads and the quiet stillness of long-forgotten farmland. The cassette tape still played on loop at his mind, his father's voice haunting every second, every breath. Claire's broken plea in the video lingered deeper, though, like an echo trapped in his ribs. She had warned him not to trust Evelyn. That changed everything. And yet, he had no way of knowing who was telling the truth anymore. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. The man he'd called his father was part of a psychological experiment that turned his life into a series of manipulated events. His aunt, who just days ago he barely spoke to, was now a gatekeeper of buried secrets and possibly worse. And Claire, the only person he ever truly let in, was both victim and accomplice in a game Daniel never agreed to play. The more he uncovered, the more the ground seemed to vanish beneath his feet. He pulled into the driveway of an old friend, Ethan, his childhood best friend, and the only constant through the chaos of growing up. But now, even Ethan's role was suspect. Daniel needed answers. Real ones. And if Ethan had been part of the program all along, there would be nowhere left to hide from the truth. When Ethan opened the door, there was no hesitation, no fear, just a calm smile that Daniel had seen 1,000 times before. But now, he questioned whether it had ever been real. They sat in the dim living room, Daniel choosing his words carefully, watching every twitch of Ethan's expression. "Tell me the truth," Daniel said quietly. "How long have you known?" Ethan stiffened. "Known what?" "That my life, my entire life, has been manipulated. That my father was part of something bigger. That Claire was never just the girl next door."
Don't play dumb, man.
"Just tell me." Ethan looked down at his hands, silent for a long time. And then, in a voice Daniel had never heard from him before, cold and hollow, he replied, "Since we were 12. Daniel's stomach dropped. It was worse than he thought. "You lied to me all these years?" "I didn't have a choice," Ethan snapped. "They didn't give me one. My family was part of it too. You think I wanted this? You think I liked watching you fall apart every time they pulled a new string? I tried to help you.
I kept things from them.
I lied for you to them. But you didn't stop it," Daniel said, rising. "You let it happen." Ethan stood too, fists clenched. "What would you have done in my place? They threatened my mom. They had us by the throat. Daniel, you were the center of this, but the rest of us, we were just satellites. And believe me, the second you started asking questions, they started watching again." Daniel turned to leave, but Ethan stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "There's more. They've been monitoring you since you opened that box. That wasn't just some forgotten keepsake, they planted it. It was a trigger. They wanted you to find it, to chase it." "Why?" Ethan hesitated, then looked Daniel square in the eyes. Because they think you're the next phase of the experiment. The words struck like a hammer. Phase? Experiment? Daniel wasn't even sure what that meant anymore. As he drove away, his mind buzzed with conflicting truths and emerging threats. He wasn't just a subject of some dark psychological project. He was now the target of a new, more invasive one. And the deeper he went, the more impossible the choices became. That night, an anonymous envelope appeared under his door. Inside were two things: a photograph of Claire, bound and unconscious, her location barely visible in the background, what looked like a shipping container marked with a serial number, and a burner phone with a single message: "You want her back? Walk away. Stop digging. Or she disappears for good." Daniel's vision swam as the weight of the ultimatum crushed down on him. This wasn't just about the truth anymore. It was about survival. It was about choosing between someone he loved and the truth that had consumed his world. But could he really just let go? Could he walk away from a lifetime of lies, manipulation, and betrayal and pretend it never happened? He thought about calling the number on the phone. But then, a deeper instinct kicked in, paranoia rooted in something real. What if it was a trap? What if making that call meant condemning Claire and himself? Or worse, what if this was yet another manipulation, testing whether he'd take the bait? He had no proof that she was still alive. No guarantee that backing off would even save her. The only certainty was that someone very powerful wanted to bury this story, and they were willing to destroy anyone who refused to stay silent. Daniel stared at the phone for hours, replaying every memory, every smile from Claire, every cold command from his father, every warning from Evelyn. His hands trembled as he realized the gravity of his next move. He couldn't go to the police.
Couldn't trust his family.
Couldn't even call the one friend he thought he had. The walls were closing in, and this time, there was no escape route. Only hard, irreversible choices that would change everything. And then he noticed something. On the back of the photograph of Claire, a handwritten note, almost invisible in the light. For words, she knew the baby. What baby? The question slammed into him like a freight train. Daniel froze. That could mean what he thought it did. It was impossible. It made no sense. But somewhere, deep down, the tiniest spark of fear ignited in the back of his mind. Because he had seen that baby before, a photo buried at the bottom of the locked box. A photo of his father, holding a child that wasn't Daniel. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The image of that baby, so familiar yet wrong, stayed burned behind his eyes like a cruel brand. His father, so meticulous, so controlled, had held a child that wasn't his son, in a photo aged perfectly to suggest it had been taken before Daniel was even born. The handwriting on the back of Claire's photo haunted him more. She knew the baby. Had Claire uncovered something that reached beyond just family secrets, something that might explain why she was taken, why she'd begged him to stop searching, and why everyone who should have helped him had instead lied, hidden, or vanished? There were too many gaps, too many whispered threats, and disappearing leads. But one thing was finally clear. This wasn't just about Daniel. It never had been. By morning, he had a new plan. He wasn't going to run. And he wasn't going to make another move alone. He drove to the university archives, one of the few places where his father's old research projects were still stored under tight, bureaucratic lock and key. His dad had been a behavioral science professor before he retired early, but Daniel now saw that title as a mask. There had been classified studies, sealed case files, and a private department that wasn't on any public record, what insiders called the Driftwood Trials. Ethan had mentioned phases. What if Daniel wasn't just a subject? What if he was phase 2? Inside the library, Daniel bribed a junior assistant for access to the sub-basement files with a story about writing a thesis on discontinued research ethics. What he found was worse than anything he imagined. The Driftwood Trials weren't just psychological case studies. They were entire simulations. Families built from scratch. Lives engineered from birth. Children adopted or placed strategically to observe emotional bonding, response to trauma, and inherited loyalty. They weren't researching behavior. They were manufacturing identity. Daniel's hands shook as he flipped through one yellowing folder labeled Control Subject, DW. Inside, there were photos of him, some taken from across the street, others in his own home. Not just from his childhood, but recent ones. Monitoring didn't stop when the subject grew up. It intensified. There were notes. Subject unaware. Phase 2 initiated. Instability increasing. Contact with Claire G approved. She'd been assigned to him. Claire wasn't just part of his life. She was inserted into it. Daniel staggered back in his chair, the file still open on the desk. His entire life, every friend, every romance, every conflict, had been prescripted like a social experiment. His love wasn't accidental. It was orchestrated. And it meant that Claire's final warning had been something more than a desperate plea. She wasn't just scared for herself. She'd fallen in love with him too, and that made her a threat to the experiment. He heard footsteps approaching and quickly tucked the file into his coat. But it was too late. A familiar voice called out his name. Daniel? He turned to see Evelyn, his aunt, standing in the hallway. But this time, she wasn't alone. Two men in plain suits stood behind her, and her voice had lost its warm, maternal lilt. I told you to stop digging. I trusted you, Daniel whispered, backing away, his heart thundering in his chest. You said you weren't involved. She sighed, almost with pity. You were never supposed to open that box. You were never supposed to remember. Your father made mistakes. He grew attached. But we had a plan, Daniel. We all did. And you were part of something bigger. You still are. You watched me. My entire life, you watched me. It was for science, she said coolly. Until it wasn't. He bolted, sprinting through the archive's back corridors and emergency exits, the stolen file under his arm. As alarms blared, he could hear footsteps behind him. Fast, heavy, organized. They weren't trying to scare him anymore. They were trying to catch him. That night, he called a name he never thought he'd say again, his mother's. She'd left when he was a child, and no one ever explained why. But now he wondered if she had known all along. If she'd escaped. She answered on the third ring, her voice hushed but urgent. Daniel? Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Why did you leave? Her voice broke. Because I couldn't protect you if I stayed. Your father. The program. I tried to fight it, but they owned everything. I ran when I found out what they were doing to you. But I always hoped you'd never find out. Well, I did, he said. And I think they're going to kill me. She didn't deny it. You need to listen to me very carefully. There's someone else, a woman named Dr. Lenora Hale. She was part of the research team back then, but she went underground. She's the only one who might still have the original documents. Find her. Before they do. Just before the line cut out, Daniel heard her whisper, Don't trust anyone else. Not even Ethan. The phone died. And that's when Daniel knew the betrayal ran even deeper than he feared. Because Ethan was already standing outside his window. Daniel's lungs burned as he sprinted through the forested ravine, branches slashing at his arms and the cold breath of early morning coiling around his face. Behind him, he could hear Ethan's footsteps closing in, not in panic, but in rhythm, like a hunter finally closing in on prey he'd been tracking for years. Everything Daniel thought he knew had been ripped away like a scab too long left to fester. His family, his past, his identity, none of it was ever real. They'd been part of a design, a human lab maze built to observe how far one man would go for the truth once he started questioning the lies. But they'd underestimated one thing. They'd underestimated his rage. Hours earlier, he had tracked down Dr. Lenora Hale. She was living under a false name in a rundown home in Montana, far off any grid. Her hair had gone completely gray, and her voice trembled not from age, but from the weight of guilt she'd carried like a coffin strapped to her back. She told him everything. His father had helped launch the Driftwood Trials with noble intentions, to create emotionally resilient children by orchestrating their environments and measuring long-term development. But what began as theory mutated into manipulation. Emotions were not observed, they were tampered with. Entire family units had been orchestrated. And when Daniel's father saw the trauma it was causing, He tried to pull out, but the program had already gone too far. There were backers, powerful ones, government contracts, pharmaceutical tie-ins. And Ethan? He had been promoted for his ruthlessness. The final proof was on a microdrive Dr. Hale had risked her life to keep hidden, encrypted under layers of false academic research. It held surveillance footage, internal memos, and the most damning detail. Daniel's adoption had not been the result of an accident or tragedy. It was a deliberate placement. He was chosen because his genetic markers made him ideal for high emotional sensitivity and responsiveness. The entire box he'd found in the attic? It had been planted.
A test.
Phase 3. Armed with a drive, Daniel had planned to expose everything. He was going to bring it to a journalist who had been following similar stories, unaware how close she was to the truth. But before he could even reach her, Ethan showed up at the motel where Daniel was hiding. No warning, no subtlety, just a cold stare and a question that felt like a knife to the soul. Did you really think you were the only one being watched? Daniel fled. He had no plan, just instinct. And now, sprinting through the woods with a microdrive duct-taped inside his jacket, he finally saw the cabin in the distance, the last safe house Dr. Hale had shown him. If he could reach it, he could transmit the data, blow the whole thing open, end this. But Ethan wasn't going to let that happen. He tackled Daniel from behind, slamming him into the mud, his knee crushing Daniel's shoulder. They wrestled, breathless and vicious, not like men but like animals. No words, just the sound of fists meeting flesh, bones straining under pressure, teeth grinding in fury. Finally, Ethan pinned him, face wild, eyes glowing with something close to fanatical devotion. "You were never supposed to get this far," he growled. "You think this is about you? There are hundreds of you. Hundreds. You were just one of the better ones." Daniel spat blood onto his face. "Then why are you so scared of me?" Ethan pulled out a syringe from his coat, clear liquid, unmarked. "Because they want you neutralized before the press gets involved. You're the last liability." But Daniel had one last move. While Ethan prepared the injection, Daniel reached for the flare gun hidden in his boot. A last-ditch failsafe, courtesy of Dr. Hale. He didn't hesitate. He fired directly into Ethan's chest. The flare ignited with a hiss and an eruption of smoke and fire, sending Ethan staggering backward, screaming as his coat lit up. Daniel didn't wait to see if he lived. He ran to the cabin, kicked open the door, and slammed the satellite uplink into the receiver. The upload started. 90 seconds. Outside, he heard Ethan's screams fade into a sickening silence. 30 seconds. Suddenly, the room's emergency lights switched to red. A voice came through the radio system, calm, clinical, and female. Phase 4 protocol initiated. Subject Daniel has reached anomaly threshold. Reset authorization required. His breath caught. Reset? Before he could process it, the cabin's walls shifted. Literally shifted. Panels rotated. Wires sparked. The floor beneath his feet started to hum. And that's when it hit him. The cabin wasn't real. None of this was. It was another simulation. The entire chase, the escape, even Dr. Hale's sanctuary, it had been one final test. A way to see if the subject would upload damning data against those he once trusted, even if he knew it would destroy every relationship he ever had. Would he risk burning the illusion of family for the truth? He looked up at the blinking terminal. The upload was at 99%. And then, the screen went dark. Complete black. A new screen appeared. "Congratulations, Daniel. Driftwood Phase 4. Completed. Proceeding to observation debrief." The door behind him opened. And in walked Claire.
Alive. Smiling.
Wearing a lab coat. "Welcome back," she said softly. "We've been watching your choices. And you passed." Daniel stepped back, his heart hammering louder than the sound of the machine. "You were never real?" he asked, his voice cracking. Her smile wavered for the first time.
"No.
"I just wasn't who you thought I was." And then cut to black. Because in that final second before the video ends, the screen flashes with a new message. Driftwood Phase 5. Audience assimilation begin. You watching right now? You're part of the experiment too. For a long time, there was only silence. No more simulation buzz. No more secret voices echoing through unseen speakers. No more digital walls pretending to be home. Daniel sat alone on a park bench overlooking the edge of a lake, unsure whether the water shimmered from sunlight or illusion. 3 weeks had passed since the Driftwood program had formally ended. At least, that's what they claimed. Claire had walked away after the final debriefing, her eyes briefly faltering with something resembling guilt, or maybe it was pride. They told him he could go back to his life, that his participation had provided extraordinary insights into human emotional resilience. They offered him a settlement, hush money wrapped in polite language and corporate contracts. They even offered him therapy, security, relocation. But none of those things could repair what had been taken, because what was stolen wasn't just truth. It was trust. The kind of trust that lets you close your eyes at night and believe the people you love are exactly who they say they are. The microdrive, once so crucial to his escape, now sat encrypted and inert in his pocket. He no longer knew if it had ever truly been real. He tried taking it to journalists, but the story was always the same. Something about classified clearance, unverifiable sources, a polite refusal to dig deeper. The deeper truth Daniel uncovered wasn't about conspiracies or hidden labs. It was about human willingness to accept what we're told when it comes wrapped in love, tradition, and family. The attic box had been a trap, yes, but it had also been a mirror. It forced him to look at the parts of himself he had buried under years of routine, unasked questions, and blind loyalty. And that was the hardest part, realizing that the people he loved most may have been characters in someone else's experiment, but his emotions for them had been real. Every memory, every ache, every joyful laugh, that was his. No lab could take that. One afternoon, a letter arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo. Old, weathered, the edges curling. It was a group shot of children, maybe 10 or 12 of them, all standing in front of what looked like a nondescript government building. One of them was Daniel. Another, he realized with a jolt, was Claire. The message on the back was written in a hand he didn't recognize. Not everything was fiction. Some of us still remember. It wasn't proof. It wasn't closure. But it was enough to remind him that he hadn't been the only one trapped in that web of lies. There were others. Maybe they were out there, searching too. Maybe not everyone had given in to the story they were told. Daniel started documenting everything. Not for exposure or revenge, but for legacy. For those who might stumble onto the same questions. For the sons who one day might find boxes in their attics. He didn't want vengeance anymore, he wanted awareness. Truth wasn't always a weapon. Sometimes it was a compass, even if it pointed into the unknown. And so he began writing, sharing cryptic pieces of his experience under a pseudonym online, hidden in podcasts and deep-dive Reddit threads. Nothing that would trigger alarms, but enough to plant seeds. Enough to let the next person know they weren't crazy. They weren't alone. Then, one morning, as he sat with his coffee watching a news alert flash on TV about a whistleblower leaking classified information tied to human behavior research funded by legacy defense contracts, he felt something shift inside him. The image was blurry, distorted, but for a moment he swore he saw Ethan's face in the background, alive, older, watching the cameras from afar. A chill ran down Daniel's spine, not from fear, but from certainty. The program wasn't dead. It had just changed names. Driftwood may have ended, but the story had only paused. As the screen faded to black and the news anchor moved on to the next trending headline, Daniel turned off the TV and stared at his reflection in the dark glass. Not as a victim, not as a subject, but as someone who had walked through the fire and come out forged. The conspiracy hadn't broken him. It had awakened him. And that was something no program could ever control. Somewhere, a box sat sealed in another attic. Somewhere, another life was waiting to be cracked open. And Daniel knew, when that lid came off, when another truth spilled into the light, it wouldn't just be the past rewritten. It would be history reborn. And maybe, just maybe, the world would finally be ready to hear it.